The velvet box sat on the mahogany table like a ticking bomb. Julian didn't notice the silence that followed him into the room, draped in the easy confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Happy anniversary, Elara," he whispered, sliding a gift across the table that he didn't realize she had already seen draped around another woman's neck 48 hours prior. Elara didn't reach for the diamonds. Her hands were steady, her heart cold, and her mind already 3 steps ahead of the man who thought her silence was submission. Most women would have broken the necklace. Elara was preparing to break his life. Before we explore how a single gift dismantled a decade-long deception, tell us your thoughts on quiet justice in the comments. Elara Vance had learned to read silence long before she learned to break it. In the glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor, she sat 3 seats away from her husband, watching him present her strategy as if the words had originated in his mind. The board members nodded approvingly. Her father, Richard Vance, founder of Vance Industries, leaned back in his chair with the faint smile of a man watching his protege perform exactly as expected. Julian didn't stumble. He never did. "The acquisition timing is critical," Julian said, gesturing toward the projection screen. "We move in Q3, leverage the market dip, consolidate before year-end." Elara recognized every phrase. She had written them in a memo 3 weeks ago, refined them over late nights while Julian slept soundly beside her, confident in his position. She had presented the draft to him over breakfast, watching his eyes skim the pages with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to receiving rather than requesting. "Smart thinking, Julian," one of the board members said. Julian smiled. "It's about seeing the full picture." Elara's pen moved across her notepad in smooth, deliberate strokes. Not notes on the presentation. She already knew every word. She was documenting the moment itself. Date, time, who spoke, who received credit. Patterns, not feelings. This was the 3rd time in 2 months. Across the table, her father caught her eye briefly. There was no recognition in his gaze, no acknowledgement that his daughter had authored the very strategy being applauded. Richard Vance had built an empire on decisiveness and delegation. He trusted Julian because Julian spoke with authority. Elara had learned early that in her father's world, volume mattered more than origin. The meeting adjourned with handshakes and congratulations directed entirely at Julian. Elara gathered her materials quietly, sliding folders into her leather portfolio with mechanical precision. She did not wait for thanks. She had stopped expecting it years ago. "Elara." She looked up. Julian stood beside her, loosening his tie with one hand, phone already in the other. "Good meeting," he said absently, eyes on his screen. "Yes," she replied. "Your father seemed pleased." "He did." Julian glanced at her then, a brief flicker of assessment. "You're quiet today." "I'm always quiet," Elara said. He smiled, the kind of smile that suggested fondness without actual attention. "That's what I love about you. No drama." He kissed her cheek, a gesture performed more than felt, and walked away, already answering a call before he reached the hallway. Elara stood alone in the empty conference room, the city sprawling below her through floor-to-ceiling windows. 42 floors above the noise, above the movement, above the people who believed proximity to power was the same as possessing it. She had been working at Vance Industries for 10 years, the same amount of time she had been married to Julian Thorne. He had joined the company 6 months after their wedding, brought in by Richard Vance himself as fresh perspective. Julian had been charming then, ambitious in ways that felt collaborative rather than competitive. Somewhere along the way, asking had become assuming. Collaboration had become extraction. At first, Julian credited her in private. Then with qualifiers, Elara had some thoughts on this, which I expanded. Then he stopped crediting her at all. She had tried confronting him once, early on. "I noticed you didn't mention my involvement in the restructuring proposal." Julian had looked genuinely confused. "I thought that was understood. We're a team, Elara. What's mine is yours, What's yours is mine. The logic had sounded reasonable. It took months to realize the equation only moved in one direction. If she wanted to be seen, she would need to be undeniable. That evening, Elara returned home before Julian. Their penthouse overlooked the city's financial district, all clean lines and curated neutrality. Everything had been chosen by a designer Julian hired without consulting her. She poured herself wine and stood by the window, watching lights blink on across the skyline. 10 years. A decade of building something she believed was shared. Her phone buzzed. A message from her father's assistant. Mr. Vance would like to see you tomorrow, 9 a.m. Her father rarely requested meetings with her directly. Most communication flowed through Julian now, as if marriage had made her accessible only by proxy. Julian came home late, smelling of expensive cologne and something floral that didn't belong to either of them. Elara noticed, but didn't comment. Questions invited defensiveness, and defensiveness obscured clarity. "How was your evening?" she asked. "Long," Julian said. "Client dinner ran late." "Anyone I know?" "Probably not." "New contacts, potential partnerships." He smiled. "Boring details." "I'm meeting with my father tomorrow morning," Elara mentioned. Julian's expression shifted. Interest sharpened. "About what?" He didn't say. "Probably the acquisition timeline," Julian said. "I'll join you." "He asked for me," Elara said quietly. "Specifically." Julian paused. "Right. Of course." He studied her. "Let me know how it goes." That night, Elara lay awake beside her husband, thinking about the floral scent, the pattern she'd been documenting, the quiet erasure of her contributions. She wondered how much longer she would let silence be mistaken for consent. The next morning, Elara arrived at her father's office 15 minutes early. Richard Vance's executive suite occupied the entire northeast corner of the 45th floor. At 72, he remained sharp and formidable. "Come in, Elara." "Close the door." Richard removed his glasses. "I want to discuss succession planning. It's time to formalize the transition." Elara's pulse quickened. "Julian has been exceptional," Richard continued. "His strategic vision, his leadership presence, all of it points to him being the natural choice to take over when I step back." There it was. The confirmation that her contributions had been transferred to her husband's ledger. "I see," she said quietly. Richard leaned forward. "You've been instrumental in supporting him. That kind of partnership is valuable." He'd reduced her to Julian's support staff. As she reached the door, Richard added, "He's a good man, Elara. You chose well." She turned back. "Did I choose him? Or did you?" Richard's expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps recognition. But the moment passed. "We'll discuss the formal announcement next week." That afternoon, Elara met Catherine Morgan, head of HR, and one of the few people who saw Elara as more than Julian's wife. "You look like someone who just received bad news they expected," Catherine observed. "My father informed me Julian will be his successor." Catherine's expression tightened. "I'm sorry, though I can't say I'm surprised." She leaned forward. "Elara, I need to tell you something. There's someone. Sloane Mercer, the new marketing director. I've seen them together, late meetings, closed doors, the kind of body language that suggests more than professional collaboration." The information landed with surprising calm. Elara had suspected something. "How certain are you?" "I handle HR. I see things. Expense reports, travel schedules, calendar conflicts that don't quite add up. Individually, they mean nothing. Together." "Thank you for telling me," Elara said steadily. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Elara lied. She knew exactly. She would confirm. Document. Build an airtight case. 2 days later, Elara saw them. Not at the office. That would be too obvious. At Mercier, an exclusive jewelry boutique in the luxury district. She discovered the meeting by tracking Julian's calendar, noting blocks of time marked client meeting with no corresponding client. Through the large window, Elara watched the scene unfold with detached clarity. Julian sat across from Sloane Mercer, young, polished, beautiful. She wore professional clothing with just enough personality. Champagne silk blouse, tailored pants, authoritative heels. Julian slid a velvet box across the table. The same box Elara had seen 4 months ago when she designed custom anniversary diamonds. The same box the jeweler had shown her with pride, explaining each piece was unique, one of a kind, designed specifically for her. Sloane opened it. Even from across the street, Elara could see genuine surprise and delight. Julian leaned forward, taking her hand, saying something that made Sloane's eyes glisten. Elara stood on the sidewalk, phone recording everything. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. She felt no surge of anger. Instead, clarity. This wasn't just an affair. This was replacement. Julian wasn't having a fling. He was upgrading. With diamonds meant to celebrate a decade of marriage to the woman watching him betray her. The video captured it all. The velvet box, diamonds catching light as Sloane lifted them. Julian fastening the necklace around her throat with tenderness he hadn't shown his wife in years. Elara recorded 2 minutes, then slipped her phone away and walked off. She didn't storm in. She gathered evidence and began planning. Because if Julian thought he could erase 10 years with diamonds and lies, he was about to discover exactly how much he'd underestimated his wife. Elara didn't confront Julian about the diamonds. That would be satisfying in the moment and useless long-term. Instead, she did what she'd been trained to do. She built a case. While Julian was out at another client dinner, Elara sat in the home office. His laptop sat on the desk, password protected but not cleverly so. She'd watched him enter it enough. His university name followed by graduation year. Inside, she found exactly what she'd suspected. Email chains where he'd forwarded her confidential memos to himself, removing her name before presenting them. Shared documents where he'd copied her analysis wholesale. Calendar entries for meetings with Sloane marked external strategy sessions. Elara didn't just screenshot. She documented properly. Dates, times, file metadata. She created a timeline showing the pattern clearly. Elara creates strategy. Julian accesses her files within days. Julian presents strategy as his own. Next, she contacted Marcus Chun, an old friend from business school who now ran a corporate intelligence firm. "I need someone discreet," she told him. "Someone who can document meetings, travel, financial transactions without leaving fingerprints. You're not asking me to do anything illegal. I'm asking you to document what's already happening. Truth isn't illegal. It's just expensive." The investigators' report arrived within a week, more damning than anticipated. Julian and Sloane had been meeting regularly for 3 months. Dinners, hotel bars, weekend trips disguised as conferences. But more importantly, Julian had been sharing confidential Vance Industries information with Sloane, who was using it to position herself for senior vice president. The affair wasn't just personal. It was professional theft. Julian was grooming his mistress using stolen intelligence. Elara compiled everything into a master file. Timestamped documents, IT access logs, photographs from the investigator, email chains, expense reports that didn't match claimed whereabouts. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. 2 weeks after witnessing Julian give her anniversary diamonds to Sloane, he presented them to Elara at their actual anniversary dinner. He'd made reservations at Mercier's private dining room, the same boutique where she'd watched him with his mistress. The irony was almost artistic. The dinner was everything Julian excelled at. Expensive, well choreographed, designed to impress rather than connect. He'd ordered her favorite wine without asking if her tastes had changed. He'd arranged violinists without remembering she found public performances uncomfortable. 10 years, Julian said, raising his glass. A decade of partnership, of building something meaningful together. When dessert was cleared, Julian produced the velvet box with flourish. "I wanted this anniversary to be special, to commemorate everything we've built." He opened it to reveal the diamonds, the same stones Elara had designed, the same setting she'd approved. Except it wasn't unique anymore, because Sloane had worn it 2 weeks ago. "Happy anniversary, Elara." "They're beautiful," she said evenly. "Custom designed," Julian said with pride. "One of a kind, just like you." The jeweler said he'd never created anything like them. The lie was so smooth, Elara wondered if he even recognized it as deception anymore. Had dishonesty become so integrated he couldn't distinguish truth from performance? "Help me put them on," she said, turning to offer access to the clasp. Julian fastened the necklace, his fingers brushing her skin with mechanical affection. Elara caught their reflection, a successful couple celebrating a milestone. The image was perfect and completely false. "They suit you," Julian said. "I'm sure they do," Elara replied, feeling the weight against her collarbone. Evidence, not jewelry. The next morning, Elara called her father directly, using the private line he'd given her years ago. "I need to show you something before you make any succession decisions." "My office. 4 o'clock. Come alone." That afternoon, Elara arrived with a leather portfolio containing everything. Documents showing Julian's theft, IT logs proving unauthorized access, photographs of Julian with Sloane, financial records showing expense fraud, and her own work, the strategies that had driven growth for 3 years. Richard examined everything in silence. When he finally looked up, his jaw was tight with controlled anger. "How long have you known?" "About the affair?" 2 weeks. "About him stealing my work?" 2 years. Richard's hands flattened on the desk. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I needed proof, not grievances. And because I needed to know if this company could see me as more than Julian's wife." Richard stood, moving to the windows. "The Singapore expansion, the restructuring, the acquisition strategy. All of it," Elara confirmed. "Every major strategic initiative for 3 years originated from my research." Julian simply presented it as his own. And I believed him. Richard's voice was flat with realization. "I gave him credit for your vision." Richard turned from the window, looking at his daughter with something resembling respect for the first time in years. "The gala is in 3 days. I think it's time the board understood who's really been running this company." "What are you proposing?" "Julian expects to be announced as my successor. Instead, we're going to expose exactly what he is, a fraud who built his reputation on your work. And then we're going to show them who should actually be running Vance Industries." For the first time in years, Elara felt seen. Not as Julian's wife, not as Richard's daughter, but as herself, competent, strategic, ready to claim what she'd built. The annual Vance Industries Gala brought together board members, major investors, key partners, and media covering the business world's elite. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, it was the company's signature event. Elara dressed with unusual care. She chose a midnight blue dress, elegant and professional, commanding respect without demanding attention. The anniversary diamonds sat in their box on her dresser. She left them there. Tonight wasn't about wearing evidence. It was about presenting it. Julian dressed in his favorite suit, checking his reflection with satisfaction. "Your father's going to make the announcement tonight. I can feel it. The timing is perfect." "I'm sure it will be memorable," Elara replied neutrally. They arrived together, presenting the united front of a successful marriage. Julian worked the room with practiced charm, shaking hands, accepting congratulations for achievements that weren't his, positioning himself as the natural heir. Elara moved through the crowd with quieter purpose, having conversations that mattered rather than performing ones that looked impressive. She was watching for Sloane Mercer. She found her near the bar, stunning in a silver silk dress. And there, catching the light with every movement, were the anniversary diamonds. Sloane wore them prominently, displayed like a trophy, completely unaware she was wearing evidence. Elara felt calm settle over her. Everything was in place. The trap was set. At 8:30, Richard Vance took the podium. The ballroom fell quiet with respect reserved for men who control billions. Richard began with standard opening, gratitude to investors, acknowledgement of achievements, celebration of growth. Then his tone shifted. Tonight, I want to address something troubling, Richard said. The question of merit versus performance. Of who creates value and who claims credit. Of what it means to truly lead versus simply appearing to lead. The room's attention sharpened. Julian's confident smile faltered. For 3 years, I've praised Julian Thorne's exceptional strategic vision, Richard continued. Tonight, I learned something that fundamentally changes that narrative. The large screen activated, displaying the first slide. Singapore expansion proposal. Author, Elara Vance. Date, March 15th. Julian presented this to our board on April 8th. Richard said, clinical and precise. He received unanimous approval. I praised his vision publicly and privately. The next slide, file properties with access logs. Here are the metadata and IT records. Created by Elara Vance 3 weeks before Julian's presentation. These logs show exactly when he accessed her secured files, copied the content, and presented it as his own. The ballroom went completely silent. Julian's face drained of color. Beside him, Sloane sat frozen, the diamonds suddenly conspicuous. Richard advanced through more slides methodically. The restructuring proposal, Elara's work, Julian's presentation. The acquisition strategy, Elara's analysis, Julian's credit. Email chains showing him forwarding her confidential memos with her name removed. What you're seeing, Richard said, is a pattern of intellectual theft spanning 3 years. Then came the photographs. Julian and Sloane at dinner. At hotels. At the jewelry boutique. These images document an affair. But more importantly, they document professional misconduct. Mr. Thorne has been sharing confidential company information with Ms. Mercer, information she's used to position herself for advancement. The final slide, split image. Left, Elara's diamond commission form with her signature. Right, photograph of Sloane wearing those exact diamonds at that exact moment. These diamonds, Richard said, were custom designed by my daughter for her 10th wedding anniversary. The jeweler confirmed they were one of a kind. Julian gifted them to Ms. Mercer 2 weeks ago, then presented a duplicate set to his wife, telling her they were unique. The room erupted in whispers. Phones appeared, documenting the scandal. Julian stood abruptly. This is a witch hunt. You're destroying my career over a marital dispute. This is accountability for documented fraud, Richard cut in sharply. You stole intellectual property. You violated fiduciary duty. You shared confidential information with unauthorized parties. The personal betrayal is merely context. Effective immediately, Julian Thorne is removed from all positions within Vance Industries. His equity is forfeit under the fraud clause. Legal proceedings begin Monday. Security will escort you from the premises. 2 security officers appeared. The room watched in absolute silence as they approached Julian. Julian looked at Sloane, who was removing the necklace with shaking hands, her face pale. Their eyes met. Mutual recognition that the future they'd been building had collapsed in 20 slides. Then security escorted Julian toward the exit. His posture was rigid, trying to maintain dignity while his reputation dissolved with each step. The doors closed behind him. Richard raised his hand. I want to be clear. This is not a family dispute. This is accountability for documented fraud and fiduciary violation. He gestured toward Elara. My daughter will now update you on the Singapore expansion, which she has led independently with exceptional results. I want you to understand that while one executive was stealing, another was building our future. Elara stood, legs steady despite the emotional weight. She moved to the podium. The Singapore expansion is ahead of schedule and under budget. She began, voice clear. Over the past 6 months, we've secured partnerships with 4 major regional distributors, established local operations, and positioned ourselves to capture 18% market share in Southeast Asia within the first year. She walked through slides with precision, facts, figures, projections. Her work, bearing her name, presented in her voice. Evidence of independent capability. The board listened with visible relief. Here was stability, competence, legitimate achievement. When Elara concluded, applause followed, different from what Julian received earlier. This was recognition, not performance. "Well done," Richard said quietly, and for the first time, the words carried genuine pride. The gala continued with Elara answering questions about Singapore, demonstrating continuity and strength. Sloane slipped out through a side exit, the silver dress disappearing, the diamonds left on an empty table like abandoned evidence. Board member David Chen approached. "I owe you an apology. I was completely taken in by Julian's presentation. After tonight, after seeing how you handled this, I can't imagine anyone more qualified to lead this company." "Thank you," Elara said simply. Finally, only Elara and Richard remained among empty tables and champagne glasses. "How do you feel?" Richard asked. "Clear," Elara answered. "Not vindicated. Not satisfied. Just clear. That's the right feeling. Justice doesn't provide satisfaction. It provides closure, clarity, the ability to move forward. Do you think he'll fight back?" "He'll try. But with this much evidence, publicly presented, his options are limited. He can contest, but he can't win. The documentation is too comprehensive." They walked toward the exit together. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow, we begin rebuilding trust with partners who will have questions. We begin formal succession planning with a board that now understands who should lead. And you begin the next phase of your career, not as my daughter or Julian's wife, but as the executive who proved she could handle crisis with precision while maintaining integrity." "And Julian?" "Julian begins facing consequences. Legal consequences for intellectual property theft, financial consequences for violating his contract, professional consequences that will follow him for the rest of his career. Everything he tried to take will be recovered. Everything he built on deception will collapse." Richard paused. "I owe you an apology as well. I should have seen what was happening. Should have recognized your contributions without needing evidence files. I let traditional thinking blind me. You see it now. That's what matters. I'm proud of you, not for exposing Julian, but for maintaining your integrity while he was losing his." Elara drove home alone through streets that seemed quieter than usual. The penthouse was dark when she entered. Julian's belongings were still there. All of it would need to be removed, but not tonight. She walked to the windows and looked out at city lights marking other lives, other dramas, other reckonings. She thought about Julian, probably in some hotel room, calling lawyers. About Sloane, whose career had imploded. About board members who'd been so ready to accept Julian's narrative. She felt no anger. What she felt was simpler, ownership. She owned her work, her reputation, her future. She owned the truth presented tonight. And most importantly, she owned herself in ways she never had when making herself smaller to accommodate Julian's ambition. Tomorrow would bring meetings, statements, legal proceedings. The board would formally approve Richard's decisions. Partners would require reassurance. But tonight, in the quiet of a penthouse that would soon be entirely hers, Elara allowed herself a moment of stillness. She had not destroyed Julian Thorne. She had simply stopped protecting him from consequences of his own choices. Stopped enabling his deception through silence. Refused to continue being erased. In doing so, she discovered something her mother had tried to teach her, that the most powerful thing a woman can do is not raise her voice in anger, but refuse to lower it in deference. Not to scream louder, but to stop being silent. Not to demand to be seen, but to become undeniable. Justice had arrived not with thunder, but with evidence. Not with emotional confrontation, but with documented truth. Not with revenge, but with revelation. And that was exactly as it should be. Additional context and reflection. The pattern had been building for years, so gradual that Elara had almost convinced herself it was normal. But sitting in that conference room, watching Julian accept praise for work she'd bled over, something crystallized. This wasn't partnership. This wasn't even theft in the traditional sense. It was erasure, systematic, deliberate erasure of her professional identity. She thought back to their early years, when Julian would at least acknowledge her contributions privately. "Great idea, babe," he'd say over dinner. "I tweaked it a bit for the presentation." The tweaks were minimal, a word changed here, a slide reordered there. Just enough for him to claim ownership. By year 3, even the private acknowledgments had stopped. Now he took her memos, her analyses, her late-night insights, and presented them as if they'd materialized fully formed in his own brilliant mind. And the worst part? Everyone believed it. Her father, the board, even Catherine had been fooled until recently. Watching Julian with Sloane through that boutique window, Elara felt something shift inside her. Not heartbreak. She mourned the death of their real marriage years ago. What she felt was a kind of cold, focused rage that demanded strategy rather than tears. The diamonds were the perfect symbol. Julian had taken something meant to celebrate their decade together and given it to his replacement. He'd looked his wife in the eye and called them one of a kind, while knowing another woman had warned them days earlier. The audacity of it would have been almost impressive if it weren't so pathetic. What Julian didn't understand, what he'd never understood about Elara, was that she didn't need to be the loudest person in the room to be the most dangerous. She just needed to be the most prepared. The investigator's report revealed details Elara hadn't even suspected. Julian had expensed romantic dinners as client development. He'd booked hotel rooms as conference lodging for conferences that didn't exist. He'd used company resources to wine and dine the woman he was grooming to replace his wife, both personally and professionally. But the most damning detail was the information sharing. Julian had given Sloane access to confidential market analyses, competitor intelligence, and strategic plans that should have been limited to C-suite executives. He was essentially building her career using proprietary company information, positioning her for roles she hadn't earned through her own work. It was a house of cards built on deception, and Elara was about to bring it all crashing down. The silence in the ballroom after Richard's presentation was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as 200 of the business world's most powerful people processed what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a corporate scandal. It was a masterclass in accountability. Elara watched Julian's face cycle through emotions: shock, denial, anger, and finally a desperate calculation as he tried to find a way out. But there was no way out. The evidence was irrefutable, presented in front of everyone who mattered. When security approached him, Julian tried one last time to maintain dignity. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin, attempted to walk out under his own power rather than be escorted. But the officers remained close, a silent reminder that he no longer had the privilege of leaving on his own terms.